The Griffin, a tale of Brothers Grimm. There was once on a time a king, but where he reigned and what he was called, I do not know. He had no son, but an only daughter who had always been ill, and no doctor had ever been able to cure her. Then it was foretold to the king his daughter should eat herself well with an apple. So he ordered it to be proclaimed throughout the whole of his kingdom that whosoever brought his daughter an apple with which she could eat herself well would have her to wife and be king. This became known to a peasant who had 3 sons. And he said to the eldest, "Go out into the garden and take a basket full of those beautiful apples with the red cheeks and carry them to the court. Perhaps the king's daughter will be able to eat herself well with them, and you will marry her and be the king." The lad did so, and set out. When he had gone a short way, he met a little iron man, who asked him what he had in the basket, to which he replied, "Oulé," for so was he named, "frog's legs." On this the little man said, "Well, so shall it be, and remain," and left. At length Oulé arrived at the palace, and made it known he had brought apples with which the king's daughter could be cured if she ate them. This delighted the king hugely, and he caused Oulé to be brought before him, but alas, when he opened the basket, instead of having apples in it, he had frog's legs that were still kicking about. On this the king grew angry, and had him driven out of the house. When he got home, he told his father how it had fared with him. Then the father sent the next son, who was called Sham, but all went with him as it had gone with Oulé. He also met a little iron man, who asked what he had in the basket, and Sham said, "Hog's bristles." And the iron man said, "So shall it be, and so shall it remain." When Sham got to the king's palace and said he brought apples with which the king's daughter might eat herself well, they did not want to let him go in. One fellow had already been there, and had treated them as if they were fools. Sham, however, maintained he certainly had the apples, and they ought to let him go in. At length they believed him and led him to the king, but when he uncovered the basket he had but hog's bristles. This enraged the king most terribly, so he caused Sham to be whipped out of the house. When he got home he related all that had befallen him. And the youngest boy, whose name was Hans, but who was always called Stupid Hans, came and asked his father if he might go with some apples. "Oh," said the father, "you would be just the right fellow for such a thing. If the clever ones can't manage it, what can you do?" The boy, however, did not believe him, and said, "Indeed, father, I wish to go." "Get away, stupid fellow. You must wait till you are wiser," said the father to that, and turned his back. Hans, however, pulled at the back of his smock frock, and said, "Indeed, father, I wish to go." "So far as I am concerned, you may go, but you will soon come home again," said the old man in a spiteful voice. The boy, however, was tremendously delighted, and jumped for joy. "Act like a fool, you grow more stupid every day," said the father. Hans, however, did not care about that, and did not let it spoil his pleasure. As it was then night, he thought he may as well wait until the morrow, for he could not get to court that day. All night long he could not sleep, and if he did doze for a moment, he dreamt of beautiful maidens, and palaces, and gold and silver, and all kinds of things of that sort. Early in the morning he went forth on his way, and directly afterwards the shabby-looking man in his iron clothes came to him and asked what he was carrying in the basket. Hans gave him the answer that he was carrying apples, with which the king's daughter was to eat herself well. "Well then," said the little man, "so shall they be, and so shall they remain." But at the court they would not let Hans go in, for they said 2 had already been there who told them they were bringing apples. One of them had frog's legs, and the other had hog's bristles. Hans, however, resolutely maintained he most certainly had no frog's legs, but some of the most beautiful apples in the whole kingdom. As he spoke so pleasantly, the doorkeeper thought he could not be telling a lie, and asked him to go in. And he was right, for when Hans uncovered his basket in the king's presence, golden yellow apples came tumbling out. The king was delighted, and caused some of them to be taken to his daughter, and waited in anxious expectation until news should be brought to him of the effect they had. Before much time had passed by, news was brought to him, and who do you think it was who brought the news? It was his daughter herself. As soon as she had eaten of the apples, she was cured and sprang out of bed. The joy the king felt cannot be described, but now he did not want to give his daughter in marriage to Hans, and said he must first make him a boat which would go quicker on dry land than on water. Hans agreed to those conditions, and went home and related how it had fared with him. Then the father sent Oulé into the forest to make a boat of that kind. He worked diligently, and whistled all the while. At midday, when the sun was at its highest, came the little iron man again, and asked what he was making, and Oulé gave him for answer wooden bowls for the kitchen. The iron man said, "So it shall be, and so shall it remain." By evening Oulé thought he had now made the boat, but when he wanted to get into it, he had nothing but wooden bowls before him. The next day Sham went into the forest, but everything went with him as it had with Oulé. On the 3rd day Stupid Hans worked away most industriously, so that the whole forest resounded with heavy strokes, and all the while he sang and whistled merrily. At midday, when it was the hottest, the little man came again, and asked what he was making. "A boat that will go quicker on dry land than on water," said Hans, "and when I have finished it, I am to have the king's daughter for wife." "Well," said the little man, "such a one it shall be, and so shall remain." In the evening, when the sun had turned to gold, Hans finished his boat, and all that was wanted for it. He got into it, and rowed to the palace, and it went swiftly as the wind. The king saw it from afar, but would not give his daughter to Hans yet. He said first he must take 100 hares out to pasture from early morning to late evening, and if one of them got away, then he could not have his daughter. Hans was well contented with this, and the next day went with his flock to the pasture, and took great care none of them ran away. Before many hours had passed, came a servant from the palace, and told Hans he must give her a hare instantly, for some visitors had come unexpectedly. Hans, however, was very well aware what that meant, and said he would not give her one. The king might set some hare soup before his guest next day. The maid, however, would not believe his refusal, and at last she began to get angry with him. Then Hans said if the king's daughter came herself, then he would give her a hare. The maid told this in the palace, and the daughter did go herself. In the meantime, the little man came again to Hans, and asked him what he was doing. And he said he had to watch over 100 hares, and see none of them ran away, and then he might marry the king's daughter and be king. Well, good, said the little man. There's a whistle for thee. If one of them runs away, just whistle with it, and it shall come back again. When the king's daughter came, Hans gave her a hare in her apron, but when she had gone about 100 steps with it, he whistled, and the hare jumped out of the apron, and before she could turn around, it was back in the flock. When the evening came, the hare herd whistled once more, looked to see if all were there, and then drove them to the palace. The king wondered how Hans had been able to take 100 hares to graze without losing any of them, and he would not, however, give him his daughter yet. Indeed, he said he must now bring him a feather from the griffin's tail. Hans set out at once, and walked straight forward. In the evening he came to a castle, and there he asked for a night's lodging, for at that time there were no inns. The lord of the castle promised him that with much pleasure, and asked where he was going. Hans answered, to the Griffin. To the Griffin? They tell me he knows everything. I have lost the key of an iron money chest. You might be so good as to ask him where it is. Oh, yes, indeed, said Hans, I shall. Early the next morning he went onward, and on his way arrived at another castle, in which he again stayed the night. When the people who lived there learnt he was going to the Griffin, they said in the house a daughter who was ill, and they had tried every means to cure her. None of them had done her any good. Would he be so kind to ask the Griffin what would make their daughter healthy again? So Hans said he would willingly do, and went onward. There he came to a lake, and instead of a ferry boat, a tall, tall man was there who had to carry everybody across. The man asked Hans whether he was going. To the Griffin, said Hans. When you get to him, said the man, will you ask him why I am forced to carry everyone over this lake? Oh, indeed, most certainly, said Hans, and the man took him up on his shoulders and carried him across. At length Hans arrived in the Griffin's home, but the wife was at home, and not the Griffin himself. And the woman asked him what he wanted, and he told her everything. He had to get a feather out of the Griffin's tail, and there was a castle where they had lost the key of their money chest. He was to ask Griffin where it was. In another castle the daughter was ill, and he was to learn what would cure her. And not far from thence there was a lake, and a man beside it who was forced to carry people across, and he was very anxious to learn why the poor man had to do it. And the woman said, Look here, my good friend. No Christian can speak to the Griffin. He devours them all. If you like, you can lie down under his bed. In the night when he was fast asleep, you can reach out and pull a feather from his tail. And for those things you wish to learn, I will ask them myself. Hans was quite satisfied with this, and got onto the bed. In the evening the Griffin came home, and as soon as he entered the room he said, Wife, I smell a Christian. Oh, yes, said the woman. One was here today, but he went away again. And on that the Griffin said no more. In the middle of the night, when the Griffin was snoring loudly, Hans reached out and plucked a feather from his tail. The Griffin awoke instantly and said, Wife, I smell a Christian, and it seems to me someone has been pulling at my tail. And his wife said, Oh, you have been dreaming. I told you before a Christian was here today, and he went away. He told me all kinds of things, that in one castle they had lost the key to their money chest and could not find it. Oh, the fools, said the Griffin. The key lies in the wood house under a log of wood behind the door. He said in another castle the daughter was ill, and they knew no remedy that would cure her. The fools, said the Griffin. Under the cellar steps a toad has made its nest of her hair. If she got her hair back, she would be well. And he also said there was a place where there was a lake, and a man beside it who was forced to carry everyone across. Idiot, said the Griffin. If only he put one man down in the middle, he'd never have to carry another across. So early the next morning the Griffin got up and went out. Hans came forth from beneath the bed, and had a beautiful feather, and heard what the Griffin had said about the key, the daughter, and the ferryman. The Griffin's wife repeated it all once more, that he might not forget it, and then Hans went home again. First he came to the man by the lake, who asked him what the Griffin had said. Hans replied he must first carry him across, then he would tell him. So the man carried him across, and when he was over, Hans told him all he had to do was set one person down in the middle of the lake, and he would never have to carry another one again. The man was hugely delighted, and told Hans out of gratitude he would take him once more across and back again, and Hans said, No, he would save him the trouble. He was quite satisfied already, and went on his way. Then he came to the castle where the daughter was ill. He took her on his shoulders, for she could not walk, and carried her down the cellar steps, and pulled out the toad's nest from beneath the lowest step, and gave it into her hand. She sprang off his shoulder and up the steps before him, and was quite cured. Then were the father and mother beyond measure rejoiced, and gave Hans gifts of gold and silver, and whatsoever else he wished for, that they gave him. When he got to the other castle, he went at once into the wood house, found the key under the log of wood behind the door, and took it to the lord of the castle. He also was not a little pleased, and gave Hans as a reward much of the gold that was in the chest, and all kinds of things besides, cows, sheep, and goats. Well, when Hans arrived before his own king, with all these things, the money, the gold, the silver, the cows, sheep, and goats, the king asked how he had come by them, and Hans told him the Griffin gave every one whatsoever he wanted, and the king thought he himself could make such things useful, and set out on his way to the Griffin, and when he got to the lake, it happened he was the very first to arrive there after Hans. So the man put him down in the middle of it and went away, and the king had drowned. Hans, however, married the daughter and became the king. The end.